Good morning, Haiti Oropesa, with Florida You Judge, along with my two co-hosts, Keela McCaskill and Stephanie Pointer. And this morning we have a very, very special guest. He is has a passion on the issue of book banning. For those of us who have been following the news now for some time, with the Florida's certain officials have a focus on wanting to ban books. And so attorney James Michael Shaw is with us this morning, and he is going to be talking about Florida's effort at book banning. And so in just a second, we are going to have a discussion with him. Good morning, James. How are you?
Good morning, Heidi. Thank you for having me.
It's what a privilege to have you on. I've heard very great things about you. Stephanie, he's someone that you've been on the edge of your seat to have this discussion with.
Oh, absolutely. I love me some James Michael Shaw. I can't just call him James. It's got to be the whole thing.
There's a reason for it. There's another attorney named James M. Shaw, and he went to the same law school as me 1 year after. I write out Michael to distinguish ourselves from one another.
I love it. I'm a my name girl. I love that. Just what we like to do at the beginning. Welcome to the show. We like to get the basic James Michael Shaw, just who you are and what you're about, just so folks know where you're coming from and why we asked you here today.
Well, sure. I've lived in Tampa since 2007, and I came from the Detroit area. I went to the University of Miami Law School. So my father was a school teacher. My mom was a teamster who worked at Sears, and I don't come from a legal background, but I went to law school at University of Miami and practiced law in Miami for 3 or 4 years after law school was over, and then I moved to Tampa in 2007, and this is my home. Tampa is where I live now. So I work for a national law firm, but I've been my whole career volunteering in some aspect or another with the ACLU of Florida. And I'm here right now with a coalition that was kind of spearheaded by the ACLU of Florida called the Free to Be Florida, which is a coalition of parents and teachers and students and members of the community who want to push back against what PEN America is calling the ed scare, this notion that that pornography and impermissible viewpoints are being kind of peddled to the children, and that must be stopped at all costs. This movement that has gained a lot of traction throughout the country, but especially in Florida. And this is an organization it's newly formed, but it's being formed to push back against that.
Well, thank you for all your volunteering. It can sometimes engulf your entire life to be a good volunteer.
Yes, it
can. We appreciate you. I see you out and about at things that I just don't have enough hours in the day to get to, and we do appreciate that. As a community member, thank you. So today we were going to talk about the Free to Be Florida, which is the book banning movement, which is the anti-book, anti-reading movement, as far as I'm concerned. As a retired teacher, I think that when I'm a big fan of, if kids want to read it, then let's let them read it, because they see a lot of things on TV. They see a lot of things on the internet. I mean, the data shows, I did a lot of research on this when my 18-year-old was coming of age, that boys tend to start looking at pornography online by 7th grade. So the sources of these, the pictures in their head that these kids are making from reading a book are not nearly as graphic as where they're getting it from other sources, in my opinion. So I'll step off my soapbox and let you talk a little bit about the history of where this movement, the Ed Scare movement, came from.
But sure, I want to hear, before he does that, I wanted him to respond to what you just said.
Okay.
Because pornography, 7th graders. I understand that kids will do what they'll do outside of the parental supervision. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, the bigger picture is that this kind of scare, and this is a scare. It's a scare just like the satanic panic in the 80s or the Red Scare from the 50s. The country has always been susceptible to this notion that there are these boogie people out there, and they are conspiring to get your children. They are trying to influence your children away from you, and you need to fight to stop them. It's funny that you bring up an argument that children who are denied access to this will turn to pornography instead for sexual education, because that was the argument that, if you remember, that in the late 70s, early 80s, Judy Blume had written that book called Forever. And Forever was a book that she wrote at the request of her daughter. And her daughter said, there doesn't seem to exist a book about two nice teenagers who fall in love with one another and they have sex and neither one of them dies. That book does not exist, and would you please write it, Mom? Because in every single book where teenagers have sex, it's always punished by in some terrible way. And so Judy Blume wrote a book, and I recently read it, and it was very well written. And it's a very accurate depiction of the sex lives of people in their late teen years when they're first experimenting. And the characters are very responsible, and she goes and she gets birth control, and she learns about sexually transmitted diseases, and the two are responsible. And it's also realistic about at some point or another, your first relationship is probably going to end, and that's going to be very difficult for you. And she talks through all of that for an audience of people who are experiencing that in their lives. So the argument that she made when people wanted to ban her book was, do you want them to learn about this from Judy Blume, or do you want them to learn about this from Hustler magazine? Because that's where they're going to go. And at the time they didn't have the internet, but now they're this notion that there are high school children going to the library, they're reading these titillating books, and they otherwise wouldn't have experimented with sex, but then they read these library books and now they're going to do it. That is fiction. I think if you went and dusted them for fingerprints, you're probably not going to find very many fingerprints on Lady Chatterley's Lover, or even or The Bluest Eye, or even Forever. Children who are looking for information about sex go to the internet, and they're not experimenting with each other because of something that they encountered in a book. Children, teenagers have been making out with each other since the caves. That's nothing new. The question is, where are they going to learn about it from? You want them to learn about it from the internet? What's funny to me about this movement is that there seems to be no movement about trying to keep the kids off of the internet. It's just to try to keep them away from the library books. So it is a culture war proxy. It is not sincere. It is a draconian solution to a problem that didn't exist in the first place. But let me back up even further than the 70s to kind of the first movement like this, which surprisingly is not discussed very much in the context of this. So I have a couple of slides, and let me try to share them. I'm not entirely familiar with Steam, but I'm going to give it a go. Oh, there we go. Good job. So you probably don't recognize her. If you had grown up 100 years ago, you would know exactly who this was. The children called her Miss Millie, Mildred Lewis Rutherford. She was a historian for the Daughters of the Confederacy, and her father owned a plantation, enslaved 200 people. She was, if you look at her birth and death dates, you do the math, she was about 10 years old when the Civil War began and about 14 years old when it ended. Her uncle was somebody. He started the University of Georgia Law School. She went on to run a school for Southern girls. So she was very well connected, and she was a historian for the Daughters of the Confederacy. And she was very invested in peddling a narrative of the Civil War that painted her and her family as good people and not bad people. I'm not a psychologist, but I imagine it's probably very difficult to face. I think my father was a very bad person. I think he enslaved hundreds of people and did, that must have been difficult for her. It was much easier for her to sell herself on well, he was a good person who was misunderstood. And so that was the narrative that she wanted, that this lost cause narrative, which most people know even by name, is this narrative that maybe the South was the good guy in the war, and maybe the North was the aggressor, and they try to sell the story, and it kind of originated around the turn of the century, maybe 40 or 50 years after the Civil War. A lot of it with Dixon's book, The Klansman, which later became the movie The Birth of a Nation. That narrative, people wanted to teach that narrative to children as fact, even though it's not fact. So she had published this book and set up these textbook selection committees around the South. And these were committees of parents, and they would decide which textbooks were allowable and which ones were not allowable to be used to teach the children. And so here's the index for one of them. And you see that she it's very clear the narrative that she's trying to push. If you look at number 5, it says the slaves were not ill-treated in the South, and the North was largely responsible for their presence in the South. So they weren't treated badly, and if they were, it was the North's fault. That was what she wanted to talk to the children. That the federal government was responsible for the Andersonville horrors. They wanted that pushed. That the Republican Party that elected Abraham Lincoln was not friendly to the South. Right? This narrative that is not what really happened, but they wanted that taught to the children, so that in the minds of the children, this would be what happened. Right? And so these were the guidelines. And so you see that any book that said Confederate soldiers were traitors and that the war was a rebellion, those books would be rejected. They couldn't be used to teach the children. Anybody that spoke of slaveholders as cruel and unjust, that couldn't be used. A book that glorifies Abraham Lincoln and vilifies Jefferson Davis, that couldn't be used. A book that doesn't tell about the South's heroes and their deeds when the North's heroes and deeds are made prominent, that must be rejected. And so what happened was that textbook publishers knew that their books wouldn't be sold if they didn't comply with these guidelines, and they started to comply with them. And they were very successful. The Sons of Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy and their textbook selection committees. So they used tactics that this list probably looks really familiar right now. They had committees to select the textbooks. They would ban the books that didn't meet with their approval. They would attack Department of Education officials that didn't see things their way. There was a professor at the University of, Florida State University, that they got fired. They would attack individual educators like that, and they would promote books that endorsed this lost cause narrative. Now, to give you an idea what kind of books they thought were okay, this is one that they approved. They said that this book is okay to use to teach the school children. Right? This is the narratives that they were pushing. And they also tried to push this narrative that, and this should sound familiar again too, is that these are, I won't read these out loud, but these are actual quotes from some books that were approved by them. They tried to say that being enslaved wasn't that bad. You had your food taken care of for you, and it was Mildred herself said, hey, it was a benefit to the African people that they were kidnapped and enslaved, because there's lions and snakes and stuff in Africa, and they were safe from that. This was actually taught, to school children. Right? Now, if that sounds familiar, this is last year. The school passed this. The State Department of Education looked at this benchmark clarification, and they said that instruction should include that slaves develop skills which in some instances would be applied for their personal benefit. I guess learning how to operate the loom was somehow justified everything that happened that led up to that. But we're not free of this. This is 100 years later, and some of these ideas that she was pushing, we're not rid of them yet. They're still rearing their ugly heads. So this is an actual dialogue. Lowen wrote a great book called Lies My Teacher Told Me that I recommend to everybody. I believe he passed away a few years ago, but he brought a lawsuit. This is in the 1980s, and they were trying to push against a textbook that made no mention of lynchings, for instance. And so the judge, this is very rare, as lawyers know, for a judge to actually start questioning a witness in the middle of an examination. But he says, well, didn't lynchings actually happen in Mississippi? And he said, yeah, but it was long ago. Why dwell on it? He says, well, it's a history book, isn't it? So, I mean, the idea that we should just things that our ancestors did that we should be ashamed of. Well, let's just never tell the children that. And then let's tell them instead this false narrative of what happened. Now, she got her, notice if I go backwards, that case was in 1980. So Mildred Lewis Rutherford began these textbook selection committees around the turn of the century. And we're not really rid of those textbooks until 1980. So a lot of today's leaders grew up with being taught from those very textbooks. So in their minds, what is being presented by teachers today is different from what they learned and therefore wrong. But a lot of today's leaders, their ideas were formed by those textbooks that were approved by these committees. So fast forward to, I'm sorry, got her about, her way about 70 years. We had about 70 years worth of people in the South being educated by these textbooks that were written to those kind of criteria. It wasn't really until the civil rights movement and changed attitudes after World War II that kind of teaching went out of style, but you can see it coming back into style today. So where we, oops, I'm going the wrong direction.
Wait, I wanted to snip a picture of that one.
No, listen, it's going to be on afterwards.
Oh,
you
that's
can
right.
now, but it's on.
I'll get to the whole thing.
It's a pre-record, yep.
But so the recent legislation that's been passed kind of in response to this this movement, this Ed Scare, the Ed Scare is focused on a couple of things. One of them is Black history. They don't like the history that's being taught now that's a lot more accurate than the kind of fairy tale version that a lot of today's politicians grew up learning. So they want to go back to an earlier narrative, and they don't like the children learning that maybe things weren't the way that they were taught, and that maybe we were born into a world with an uneven playing field and have a moral responsibility to even that out. That's not a message that they want taught anymore. They're also going after anything that legitimizes LGBTQ communities. So, and books with gay characters in them, certainly books that give instruction on LGBT people, apart from that they're horrible. They don't want those children having access to that. They're seeing the Generation Z is reckoning with the LGBTQ population in a way that they never did, and they don't like it. And so one of the kind of knee-jerk reactions is, well, let's cut them off from sources of information that legitimize LGBT people. And then, of course, anything that has anything to do with any sort of sexuality, they want cut off. So any book, even an award-winning book like The Bluest Eye, because there's one page in that book that has a sex scene in it, the rest of the book has to go. And skeptics like me would think that it's the rest of the book that they really have a problem with. But they're pointing to that one page and saying that every book must be judged by the dirtiest page, except books that we like. Like the Bible, for instance. There's a rape scene in the Bible. There's
That's
a
true.
rape scene in the Bible. There's incest in the Bible. There's infanticide, masturbation, adultery, you name it, and that's fine with them. They don't
and keep Confederate statutes up.
right. That's part of the Confederate statues were part of. What's interesting is that those statues did not go up after the Civil War. They went when it was fresh in everybody's mind. Everybody remembered that the Civil War was a terrible time, but 50 years later, it was romanticized. And if you look at some of the memorials, if you look at the dates on them, they went up around 1914 or 1915 when the Birth of a Nation play and then later the film came out.
And now there's a legislation proposal, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Attorney Shaw, that to protect the Confederate statute. So they don't want to hear the bad that the Confederates were fighting for.
Yeah,
they don't want the kids to be taught about that, but they want to not remove the historical part that they like, the Confederates.
Right. They want they like that narrative that they grew up being taught, and they want that to continue being taught to the children, and that these people are people to be revered and not people to kind of look down on as traitors. And a lot of the legislation, I'll go through some of the specifics of it in a second, but a lot of it it's vaguely worded, and I say that it's vaguely worded on purpose because the legal term is one of my favorite legal terms is chilling effect, and a chilling effect happens when it's really unclear what you are and aren't allowed to do, and it's really unclear what the punishment would be if you guess wrong, but maybe it's going to be very draconian, and it's easier just not to do it. To give a comparison, with voting with people who had returning citizens who have served their time for a felony, it's very unclear whether or not you've paid all your fines. It's as you know, as a criminal defense practitioner, and if you're wrong about that, the state actually prosecuted people that were given voter registration cards. There
were so many of those people.
Right.
I'm dumbfounded that we spent how much money? Thousands, probably thousands and thousands of dollars investigating those people.
It was done on purpose. It was done to send a message to everybody that if you're not sure whether or not you can vote or not, you better not vote. That it was meant to kind of chill people, because if your driver's license is suspended, the state doesn't leave it up to you to know that you meet the criteria for having a suspended driver's license and stop driving. I mean, they tell you, they take the card. They don't give you the driver's license and then arrest you for driving, right? But that's what they did with these voters, was they gave them voter registration cards and then arrested them for voting and charged them with felonies to send a message that if you're not clear whether or not you can vote, you better not vote. And it's the same thing is happening right now with this kind of legislation. It's not clear what you are and aren't allowed to do, so it's better to just do nothing and toe the party line and give the story the way that they want it told. So the first one was the Stop Woke Act. And this was meant to kind of censor honest conversations about racism and history and gender inequality and the root causes. So it gives a list of things that you're not allowed to say, like you can't talk about systemic racism and white privilege. They like the narrative that racism is hatred, and as long as it's not born out of hatred, then whatever you're doing is fine. I recently visited Mount Vernon, which was where George Washington enslaved hundreds of people on Mount Vernon, and I don't think that he hated any of them, but I think that he did want their free labor, and that he was invested in a system where everybody except for him does the work, and then he gets all the money. I think he liked that. I don't think that he hated the people that were doing the work, but I think that he wanted to keep it going that way. I think he certainly didn't want to split the profits evenly with everybody who was working on the farm. But to say that is against the narrative. So they have this list of things that you're not allowed to say, and it's unclear whether some things are or don't fall within that list. So like if you look at the second to last bullet point, you're not allowed to say that a person by virtue of his or her race or sex it must be consistent with this. A person by virtue of his or her race or sex does not bear responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. So if you were to have a discussion around the idea that we are born into a world that is unfair, and we have a moral responsibility to make it fair. Our ancestors set it up for us so that some people have advantages over other people, and they shouldn't have done that. And we have a moral responsibility to repair that. Is that run afoul of that second to last bullet point? I think that they would think that it does, right? So that is something that they don't want taught, and so they passed legislation saying don't teach this, right? There is a lawsuit that was brought by the ACLU of Florida, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, so that statute is not currently in effect in higher education, but it's currently in effect in K through 12 classrooms, and the ACLU is currently looking at litigation options on the Stop Woke Act. The next one was the Don't Say Gay law, and that prohibited instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity in two categories. So the first was for kindergarten to third grade, and the second was in a manner that is not age appropriate. So again, that's very vaguely defined. What's age appropriate? What is an age appropriate thing to say to a 16 or a 17-year-old about sexual orientation or gender identity? Is it okay to give a book to a 7-year-old, or I'm sorry, a 17-year-old who thinks that he might be gay, and is it okay to provide him a book about that? But if you remember when this legislation was going through, Christina Pushaw, the governor's spokesperson, was saying, well, why do you even need to be talking to this about K through 3? I mean, there was no discussion about the second part that says in a manner that's not age appropriate. But the legislation passed, and then immediately there was questions about, well, what does this even mean? And what happens if I'm wrong? What happens if I think something's age appropriate?
Are you supposed to ignore kids? I mean, you may not have, as a teacher, sometimes you have conversations with kids who are trying to figure out who they are, and in a manner that's not age appropriate. It depends on who you ask. I mean, it really does. And what's age appropriate for one kid who's the exact same age as the kid sitting next to them, they're not the same. You can't say what's age appropriate when two kids who are the exact same age could have been born on the exact same day. You can't say what, there's one kid who you can't say anything to, and there's another kid who has been exposed to so many things that you have to reel them back to what is age appropriate.
And to piggyback on that, Attorney Shaw, what control do the parents have when their kids are in public school? So this is my question. What if a parent says that book is not something that I want my child to read? But I don't want to impose on the other kids whose parents might say, yes, that book is fine. Is there a balance there? What can a parent do under those circumstances? Right.
So it's right now, it's because the law is so unclear. It's almost county by county. Some counties have an opt-in, and some counties have an opt-out. So in some counties, your child cannot check out any books that have been flagged as restricted unless you opt them in. And in other counties, your child can't check them out if they've been opted out, but otherwise they can. In the counties, what's funny for all of the hullabaloo about all of this is that in counties that have had an opt-out, it's only a dozen or so parents actually opt their children out. Everyone else is fine with it. Everybody else understands that I would much rather, my child is going to grow up and have a sex life at some point, and none of us heard about sex for the very first time on our 18th birthday when our parents came in with the pastor and explained it to you for the first time. I mean, something about it, right? I grew up in the Detroit suburbs, and I can tell you 100% that a lot of my classmates were having sex starting at 13 and 14 and 15 years old, and they had no idea what they were doing.
Exactly.
Many of them got pregnant. Many of them got STDs because they had no access to any kind of information. They were just going off of pure instinct, right? And
I would get fired. I would literally be fired nowadays because the things I said to my students. I mean, I just flat out told them, I'm like, look, if you're not old enough to put a condom on or to tell him to put a condom on, you're not old enough to have sex. You're not mature enough yet.
You probably saved someone's life by telling them that.
Well, and I've had many students. I mean, those students who I told those things are in their early 30s now. And they still remember me saying that to them, have condom sense, because I never preached abstinence. And I know that they listened. It was really scary because the PE teacher who was in charge of teaching sex ed heard it from multiple students over and over again, which, to me is really important.
I remember my parents.
Ignorant is ridiculous.
I was younger than 16 or even 15. They bought my brother and I books about sex because they didn't want to have the conversation with us. So they bought us books for us to read ourselves.
Yeah,
but they at least did it.
Right.
If you remember,
but it was a book. But they wouldn't let those books be
in school now.
That's the whole point. They wouldn't allow those books to be in school, and to shut down teachers from educating students is just it's absurd. And every aspect of what you do as a teacher is about building relationships. It's about differentiating your instruction. It's about differentiating kids and meeting them where they're at to move them to the next level. And all of these things seem to say, that's not important. We don't care what teachers, teachers cannot have a mind of their own. They should be, zombies in the classroom and just do whatever we tell them to do. And there's no three-dimensional to the teacher. It's the most disrespectful legislation I think I've ever seen. Because
I came up in an era. I remember my dad, who was very involved. He was he was a majoring in psychology, and so I remember when cigarettes, they were very involved with the parents. They got permission to talk to us about the effects of smoking, sex education, quite a few things as they happened. They were very, the teachers were very involved with the parents. I didn't remember government being involved so much, but I did remember the teacher asking my dad how much of this I was allowed to participate in. You got a form, but he took the initiative to tell me what he wanted me to know. So by the time they shared whatever they shared, I kind of knew what they were going to talk about because he wanted to shape the narrative for me as his child and my brother. So I just want to know, like you saying, I think they're being disrespectful to the teachers for sure. But what's the role? I don't have any kids in the public school system, so I don't know what's going on in there now. And my granddaughter is in Primrose. So I don't know what they're doing right now. But what I'm trying to figure out is, what's the parents saying? What's the general consensus of these parents that's hearing all this stuff, and how do they feel about it? Because they may be my age, where they grew up when their mom was involved in what they were hearing, and you get authorization letters and all of that. But what are they saying? Like, what are people saying out there about all this stuff happening in their children's classrooms?
They still send those home. They still send them home. Absolutely, they send them home. Well, I had for my freshman, I had to sign something that said what she could read and what she couldn't read this year. And I'm like, I wrote on there she could read anything she wanted to, but she could not watch that crappy video system that they've got. And I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, that they thought that we should adopt, with a bunch of crazy stuff like folks who were
PragerU, is that what you're talking about?
Yes. I did write that she was not allowed to watch that trash. So, but other than that, if you can get her to read a book, more power to you.
What's funny about is you hear that refrain a lot: parents' rights, parents' rights, parents' rights. So, which brings me to the HB 1069, which was the Don't Say Gay expansion. It actually prohibits employees from using their preferred pronouns, and it prohibits teachers from asking students what their pronouns are, and says that no person may be required to refer to someone using their pronouns. Now, what if you have a parent who wants their child to be referred to by the child's preferred pronouns? Where's the parental rights refrain there?
Exactly.
It's only parental rights when we want this particular viewpoint. But when the parents want a different viewpoint, well, suddenly parents' rights goes out the windows, because this is not about parents' rights. Right? Mm-hmm. What I mentioned a minute ago about the pre-K through third, this HB 1069 expanded that through the 8th grade, and then the Florida Board of Education, interpreting the age appropriate, expanded it all the way to the 12th grade. So it did exactly what everyone was afraid it was going to do, is make discussions of LGBT sexuality just verboten from K through 12. And it also has some book ban provisions. So it allows anyone in a county, even if you don't have a child in school, to challenge a book. Not that if you don't have a child in school, it's none of your business. It's the whole community's business what kind of education other community members have. But it's troublesome that somebody who doesn't even have a dog in the fight can file a complaint about a book, and then if a complaint is filed, the book must be removed pending review. So that gives any one person the power to demand that a book be removed, at least for as long as it takes to review the book. And then, this is important, only the person who made the complaint can appeal that decision to a magistrate, that the schools have to pay for, and they can only appeal a decision to not ban a book. So if a book gets banned, if somebody in my community files one of these petitions and the school board ends up banning the book, I can't appeal the banning decision. They can appeal the decision not to ban it, but I cannot appeal the decision to ban it. So it puts all the power into to the hands of.
But that can be changed, though, right?
How is that equitable?
No, I don't know, but it's not. So how can the citizenry legislatively? What do we do to change that rule?
Ultimately, Haiti, that's what needs to happen is legislatively. I mean, right now, this ed scare, it's good. It's good for scaring up votes. It's good for motivating the electorate. It's good for getting people reelected. And so pandering to these people who are affected by the ed scare it makes sense to people in Tallahassee. And I don't think it's a good idea to live in a country where our elected representatives pass laws that we do not want, and then we hope that the judiciary will unwind them. That's a bad model, but that's kind of what we've got right now. I mean, this PEN America lawsuit is attacking this legislation. They just, PEN America, for those that don't know, it's a coalition of authors and teachers and students and parents, and that are pushing back against this ed scare. And in conjunction with Random House, they have sued the Escambia County School Board. Escambia County has banned 1,600 books to date, including dictionaries, including the Diary of Anne Frank, including books of Bible stories, and including books of poems by Maya Angelou. Like you can find the list of the 1,600 books that have been banned in Escambia County. I'll explain why Escambia County in a second. But
so Escambia has also sought to censor biblical stories.
Yeah, and the Bible itself has not been censored, but there's a book called 100 Bible Stories that was censored, and there's a book, like an illustrated book about the Bible that has been banned. So it's strangely enough, the people that challenge books never seem to challenge Mein Kampf. I've never seen that one on a list of banned books. Not that I'm suggesting that it should be banned. I think it's an important look into the mind of a terrible person to understand how a terrible person's mind works. There's value to having access to that. But I find it funny that whenever people are making challenges to books, no one ever seems to challenge that one. And there is pending legislation to block enforcement of this law. Another feature of this law is that it says that if any book that you're trying to read out loud at a public meeting, if you are stopped because it's pornographic, then that book gets automatically banned. And so that gives people who are activists, some of these activist groups, they will line up at the podium and for public comments at school board meetings and read the dirtiest page from a book. And if they are stopped, then that book gets automatically banned. And of course, counter activists have started going up there and reading the definitions of words out of the dictionary that are maybe a little bit intimate, and trying to get dictionaries banned. And it worked. In Escambia County, they've banned 5 different dictionaries and the Guinness Book of World Records. But so what happens, and here's like some of the books that or Amanda Gorman, she read the poem at Joe Biden's inauguration, and she's been a target for a lot of these. Out of Darkness is a book that has an interracial relationship in it, and somebody challenged that. When Wilma Rudolph played basketball, Wilma Rudolph was an Olympic athlete, and the book talked about racism that she faced growing up and overcame in order to make it to the Olympics. That book was challenged. I actually got a copy of the petition to challenge it, and it says that there's prejudice based on race, and that's race baiting, and that was the reasoning behind somebody challenging this book. So once challenged, the book goes off of the shelves until the challenges can be resolved. Well, there are 1,600 books, so they have to resolve 1,600 challenges. It can be a long time before those books get back on the shelf, all because of a challenge. Now, in Escambia County, there's one person who was responsible for, I think at last count, it was something like 600 book challenges. She's not really reading these books. And you can tell because there are online websites that have lists of books that you should challenge in your local school board, and there's typos that have been transposed into her into her petition, so we know that she's taking them from there. And she is a member of, you're not going to believe this, the Daughters of the Confederacy, right? So here we are 100 years later, and the very same group that was trying to push a specific narrative is continuing to push that. And
so, James Michael Shaw, tell us what we can do to fight this nonsense.
There's a lot of things you can do. The first thing that you should do is write to your legislators, because I know that the other side has been writing to the legislators and asking them to kind of play scare, and not necessarily hearing from the other side. They're not hearing from people that want rationality. So I think if our legislators were to be inundated by letters from people who want rationality, then I think that would have a much bigger impact than you think that it would. Legislators believe that for every letter that they get, there's hundreds and hundreds of people who feel the same way who haven't written to them. So it is never a waste of your time. You can go on to the Florida House of Representatives or Florida Senate's website and write to your legislator and say, the ed scare is scaring me. I don't like this push toward banning books. I don't like this push towards censoring Black history or erasing LGBT people out of the school curriculums and libraries. I want you to roll this back. And I think that will curtail them moving forward. If you are directly affected, I have a QR code, and there's a much more lengthy URL at the bottom. But if you are a directly affected parent or student or teacher, I know that the ACLU of Florida wants to talk to you. If you could go to this website, there's an intake form. They would like to talk to you about how these recent legislation has been directly impacting you. If you're not directly impacted, but you are concerned, here's another one, and I made a little link, which is tiny.cc/free2be Hillsborough, with the first letter capitalized of each word. It says Hillsborough, but you can join the coalition from any county using that link. And Free to Be Florida is a statewide coalition of parents and teachers and students, and we are organizing ourselves to push back at the local school board level and at the state level against this ed scare, against this movement to censor books. I don't think I mentioned it before, but PEN America keeps track of book bans nationwide, and this is spread into 41 different states, but Florida is leading the way. 40% of the banned books have been banned in Florida, so Florida is responsible for that many of them. This is the forefront of this fire that's burning and affecting the others. So if you could scan this URL or this QR code or go to this website, there's an intake form for you to join the coalition, and we're working together at the local level and at the state level to push back against these things. It is also, it's never a waste of time to write a letter to the editor for your local newspaper saying that you're concerned about this scare, that you're concerned about this push towards censorship of books and towards censorship of viewpoints that are not favored by the state. Write those and publish those. They do make a difference. And lastly, like I said, at some point or another, we do need to vote our way out of this. We need to vote with civil liberties in mind. We need to vote with freedom in mind, because as long as the legislature is not if they're not the people that are wanted by the whole state, they're just the people that are wanted by those who vote. And if those who vote keep giving us people who want legislation like this, who want results like this, then we're going to keep getting them. And maybe we can count on federal judges to invalidate the legislation that they passed, but wouldn't it be better if they never passed it in the first place? So at some point or another, we do need to have people who are concerned about these things need to vote and get others to vote and register unregistered voters to vote, and we do need to vote our way out of this. But meanwhile, these are things that you can do.
Okay.
Now-
So
Go ahead, Katie.
I'm sorry. So I want to share a verse. My favorite book is the Bible. And it says, test everything that is said. Hold on to what is good. That sounds like anti-censorship. I am a daughter of Cuban immigrants. Censorship goes on in Cuba. They control what you hear, what you read. Okay. I don't understand how anyone that's about freedom and the principles of this country would support what we're seeing under a Republican governor. Okay. My parents came from Cuba. I grew up in Miami. You mentioned you went to school in Miami, and Cubans who know what goes on in Cuba, what went on in Cuba after they left. Some of them fled for this wonderful American experience. They should be opposed to this. This looks a lot like what goes on in Cuba and in oppressive regimes. So I want you to talk about two things, Attorney Shaw. One is the case that now this just made headlines. What the federal judge said about the Escambia book banning effort.
Sure. So that was a lawsuit that was brought by PEN America, along with Random House Publishing and some authors and some parents and some students, and they were pushing back against House Bill 1069, the one I was just talking about, that allows anybody to challenge a book, and then the book gets removed until the challenge is resolved. But if you make enough challenges, it can be a long time before those are resolved.
What did the federal court say?
So the federal court, give a little procedure for people who don't know it. When you file a lawsuit against somebody, you file a complaint, and you allege this is what happened, and I deserve to have a remedy. And the other side can file what's called a motion to dismiss, which basically means even if everything you say is true, you're not entitled to a remedy. If you sue me for having brown eyes, I could file a motion to dismiss and say, having brown eyes doesn't mean that I owe you any money. And I would probably win that motion, right? So the Escambia County School Board filed a motion to dismiss, and they argued that these parents and authors and publishers, they don't have what's called legal standing to challenge this law. Legal standing is something can be wrong, but you have to be the one directly affected by the wrong in order for you to be able to seek a remedy in the courts. And a lot of wrongs go unfixed because of that standing doctrine. You have a lot of opinions that say, yeah, that's not right, but there's nothing I can do about it because you're not directly affected. Somebody who's directly affected needs to be the one that brings this lawsuit. So the judge, Judge Wetherell, who was a Donald Trump appointee, he's not a left-wing judge, he held that there is standing for them to pursue it. He dismissed the equal protection one, and I kind of understand his reasoning. His reasoning was the equal protection is that everyone gets equal protection of the law, and the plaintiffs alleged that that Black authors and LGBTQ authors and students were disproportionately affected by this law. And the judge said, well, you don't have to be LGBT to write a book about LGBT characters, and you don't have to be LGBT to read a book about them. And so it's too fuzzy to say that there's a disparate impact because the books can be written by anybody and can be read by everybody. So I don't know that I'm going to go there, but he did agree that there was a First Amendment right to get information, a First Amendment right to disseminate information, and that this law arguably interferes with that. So it is they haven't won yet, but it is an important first hurdle for them to have cleared, and they have cleared it. So they're now able to go forward with this lawsuit. And generally in a case like this one where the facts aren't so much in dispute, winning a motion to dismiss kind of portends that you're likely to win in the end. So it's very encouraging. This opinion just came out on the 12th, so yesterday. And the implications of it aren't done yet, but it means that lawsuit that was filed by PEN America and Random House can go forward, and that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. It does appear that maybe some parts or all of House Bill 1069 might get ruled unconstitutional under the First Amendment, because students do have a right to get accurate information about history, about sexuality, about LGBT issues, and this law was a blatant attempt to cut them off from that. And they say it was for parents' rights, but like I said, it's not for parents' rights, because if parents want their children to have access to this information, that doesn't mean that, okay, well then you can have it. We're for parents' rights here, right? No, they're for blocking children from accessing this information.
Right. From accessing a dictionary.
Right, even the dictionary, right? Because so it's you know, and I think maybe one of the strategies was to make them go too far so that they'd get reined in, and if that was done intentionally, good job.
You know, as a college student, I remember attending a church in Miami where I wanted to read this book, Christianity in Crisis by Hank Hanegraaff, and some clergy had a problem with that book, and I remember being told, you don't read that, because if you read that, you're going to upset the clergy. I said, now I want to read it, and I'm going to read it. You don't tell me what to read and not to read, because that is a great standard where the very word of God says, test everything, read it. If it's not good, but don't censor me from reading something, because if you tell me don't read it, I'm going to read it.
Yeah,
sure. That effect is I mean, it's funny that PEN America's report was called "Banned in the USA" from 2002 to 2000 or 2023 2022 to 2023. The report "Banned in the USA" was the name of a Two Live Crew album. Remember that?
Right. I was in Miami, yes, and they won.
They were terrible. Their music was horrible, but they sold lots and lots of records because people tried to ban it. And as soon as you try to ban something, it makes people curious about what it is. And so this notion that if exposed to an idea, then you won't be able to handle that information, so we need to keep it from you. It's not a real idea. I'll give you an example. One of the books that's most frequently attacked is Maya Kababi's book, Genderqueer, which is a memoir of the author growing up and not really being comfortable being either female or male. And it's written in a memoir format, and it's written in a comic book format. And it's a few hundred pages long, and maybe one or two of those pages have depictions of some of the author's earlier sexual experiences. And for that reason, it's always kind of a quick layup for the people that are trying to challenge books and say, well, look at this picture, right? I think even the governor held that one up, this picture. Do you want your children looking at this picture? But I read that book, and now that I'm done reading it, I'm still sure that I'm a man. It didn't really affect that, you know, the idea didn't change me at all, but I do feel like I understand that now. I understand where the author was coming from a little bit better than I understood it before I read the book. There's nothing wrong with reading a book by somebody who's got the exact opposite viewpoint of yourself, just so
it's
that
a good thing.
Yeah.
Ironically, Bill O'Reilly wrote 2 books, the history books, right? Say what you will about him as a talk show host, he's a pretty good historian, and
wow.
So he wrote a couple of history books, and those are on the list in Escambia County. He's upset that you know, or I think in Broward County somebody got, you know, the governor's own book banned, right? But so it's the idea that there's ideas that are so dangerous that you just can't let anybody be exposed to them. It's a false one, and honestly, amplify those ideas when you try to suppress them. Information wants to be free, and so when I hear that I'm not supposed to listen to something, the first thing I want to do is listen to it.
Exactly.
Right.
When I hear that somebody wants me to not be allowed to read a book that I want to read, that goes to the top of my list now. And
my first year teaching, I got called to the principal's office at 6 o'clock in the morning because somebody had told my principal that I had the book Monster, and it's a biography about Monster Cody Scott, who was a gang member in LA. And I had multiple copies of it. Why? Because I had multiple kids asking for it. So I always purchased more if I could. And so she called me down in the office. She said, "You have that book in your room?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I have it in my room or not, because it's a pretty popular book and kids read it a lot." And so she said, "Well, you get those copies back and you make sure that they're not reading it anymore." And I said, "Okay." So I went back to my room, and on my overhead, I wrote, "Miss Mackin does not want you to read these books. Please return them to me immediately." They never came back, but man, oh man, did I see them cycle through. I think probably every kid I had that year actually read it because they were like, oh, if Miss Mackin doesn't want us to read it, we must read it. So, that was Haiti reminded me of that story. So I was like, well, if they never return it, I can't make them, I'm not going to go chase a kid down and take it away from them. So,
And so what's to say about why don't parents become more active? We can't impose on every single parent. Parents have to make decisions about what their kids are going to read or not read. We shouldn't have the government imposing, even in the public school setting, all the kids are going to know. The parent has to say, I don't want my kid to read that. Or just, what about letting them reading and then you having conversations about the book with your child? They're going to find a way to read it. Whether your parent says
You're
no
not gonna read a
or
book.
not, they're going to find a way to read the book.
I listen to books with my kids. My
Kids.
kids and I have always listened to books together.
I want Attorney Shaw to talk about one more thing before we wrap up, because we only have a couple of minutes left and we've been going on. It's going to be an hour and a couple of minutes. And this is interesting to me that the Republican Party, they're doing things, this for what we've been talking about, censorship. And now I wanted you to comment on the appellate decision for the Andrew Warren case after having been removed by the governor after being duly elected twice by the voters. These are things that we see in the very country that my parents fled from. Okay, so these are not what I believe or was taught as Republican ideals. We're supposed to be about freedom and representation, people being able to vote their officials, leaders in, and this is going against that very thing. Talk to us about that recent headline that just came out a couple of days ago, where Andrew Warren's appellate fight, he was successful, and now he might have a chance of getting his job back.
Indeed. So what I'll start specifically and then speak more generally, but specifically in the district court, in the trial court, Judge Hinkle ruled that the reasons that were given by the governor for removing Andrew Warren were pretextual and they weren't real, and this was all done in bad faith and it was done for politics. But I don't have the power to do anything about it. That was basically his ruling, is that under the Florida Constitution, his remedy is to go for a trial in the Florida Senate, where he has no reason to believe he would get a fair trial, and there's nothing that a federal judge can do. He has to go take this case to the Senate. That was Judge Hinkle's ruling. On the appeal that just came out, the 11th Circuit held that we disagree. We think that he does have the ability to do that, and we think that he was disciplined for expressing a First Amendment right, and that was not allowed under the First Amendment. But we're going to send the case back down to Judge Hinkle to decide whether or not he would have been fired anyways for reasons that are permissible reasons. The impermissible reasons, we've ruled that that's impermissible, but were there any permissible reasons? And if you look at the details of the case, there were some earlier drafts of the order suspending him that the governor wanted something else added. I think there was a kidnapping case that he wanted thrown on to say that he didn't prosecute this case good enough, or something like that had nothing to do with his First Amendment activities. It's sort of a safety net. If this First Amendment thing doesn't fly, we can always say it's because of that. I think everybody knows that was a pretext. I mean, it was the governor's spokesperson the morning of the announcement said, "Get ready to watch the liberals cry," or some words to that effect, right? And it was Andrew was very vocal, and he had a national stage, and he was talking about the role of a prosecutor and exercising discretion and not prioritizing the prosecution of crimes of poverty and messages that the governor didn't like. And he was talking about would he prosecute somebody under hypothetical laws that didn't even exist yet about transgenderism and abortion rights, and he was kind of an antithesis to the message of the governor. And so the governor abused a power that the Florida Constitution gives to the governor to suspend somebody for things like an elected official who's committing crimes or is too drunk to do their job,
Right.
things like that, right?
Exactly
But
right.
he used that power and said that it was due to I think malfeasance, and so the 11th Circuit said that's balderdash. That's a pretext. What he was really fired for was exercising the right to express himself under the First Amendment, and a government official cannot fire somebody for that. And but would he have been fired anyways because of the other reason that had nothing to do with that? That's what the judge is now going to decide. I think the right answer is we all know that it had nothing to do with that. That was something that was kind of cooked up to justify what the governor wanted to do anyway. The bigger picture, though, is that you're right. That is something that would happen in Cuba, where you have a person who's elected by their own electorate. The people of Hillsborough County elected him and reelected him. That's the guy that we want. And for our governor, who, if you remember, won at least the first election by a very narrow majority, to say, well, now that I'm in power, you're going to have the people that I want, and not the people that you want.
It's tyrannical. It's very to me, it boggles me how some Cubans support this. It's identical from what they fled from. And I became an independent in 2020 after having been a Republican, because I'm seeing this is what my parents fled from. And censorship, Cuba does that, and now not honoring the will of the people, the voters going in and saying, I want this gentleman to be the state attorney of this county, and him, because of ideological differences, pretextually removing him. That's offensive.
The pretext really bothers me. There was an old Soviet Union expression that was, they're lying and we know they're lying, and they know that we know they're lying, and we know that they know that we know they're lying, and yet they do what they're going to do, right? And so we're getting to this point where, when the reason that's articulated, the rationale that's articulated for some action is not really the real rationale, and no one really expects that it is anymore. It's sort of governing in bad faith, and I don't know when this got started, but it needs to end, because it can't go on this way. We can't maintain this democracy where we have elected officials who are doing things and for one reason and saying that they're doing them for another, and the public's accepting that.
Well, thank you very much for coming on today, James Michael Shaw. We really do appreciate you, and we appreciate all the hard work that you do as a volunteer in addition to your work job. And we appreciate that you came and taught us all about the history of book banning, because I learned a lot today.
Yes, I did too. I did.
I really do appreciate that. And you come back anytime.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everything that you do. There's very few things I go through that you're not already there.
And we'll put the QR codes in the comment section for our for the video.
Okay, great.
We'll get those up later.
Okay.
Thank you.